Janet Yellen and Jerome Powell are hiding something from you. That's right. They've got this dirty little secret they don't want you to know about. And I'm going to reveal it to you right now in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over how there's almost $1 trillion that has just vanished from the TGA, the Treasury General Account. This is basically Janet Yellen's checking account that she has at the Federal Reserve. And if we look at this chart going all the way back to May 22, it was over $900 billion. So like I said, almost $1 trillion. And then if we fast forward about a year later to May of 2023, almost the entire amount is gone. So this begs the question, where did it go? Well, a lot of you watching this video right now are probably saying to yourself, well, George, that's easy because she spent money on Social Security payments or buying Zelensky a brand new mansion in Malibu, or it's going to be something like that where it's very explainable. Well, okay, fine. I understand that she spent the money out of the account. Let's remember, this is during the time frame when we're dealing with the debt ceiling issues, so she wasn't able to issue as many treasuries as she otherwise would have. But there's a lot more to the story once you start scratching beneath the surface. Let me show you what I'm referring to. First and foremost, let's go over the mechanics of the TGA. Very straightforward here. So Janet Yellen collects taxes from this guy right here, who's probably pretty pissed off that he's paying way too much. Biden's telling him to pay his fair share. He's like, well, go ahead and quantify what my fair share is, because this 30 or 40% of my paycheck that I'm giving Janet Yellen, it definitely doesn't feel fair to me. But then you have another group of people that are also buying bonds, but they're doing this, they're taking the money, whether they're buying bonds from Janet Yellen or they're paying her taxes, they're taking their money out of their bank account. Makes sense. Whether it's their checking account or savings account. So that money goes to Janet Yellen, and then she parks that at the Federal Reserve. This is the TGA that, again, in May of 22 was over $900 billion, almost $1 trillion. And then what she'll do is she'll spend that money back into the economy, let's say to Social Security recipients, just to keep this example simple. So based on these straightforward mechanics, when this money is coming into the account, all else being equal, you should expect the aggregate total of savings accounts or checking accounts to decrease, to go down. And as she spends that money back out into the economy, you should expect the account balances to go up by the exact same amount they went down to begin with. But you see, this is where it becomes quite mysterious. Editor, go ahead and throw up a chart of M1 money supply from May 22 to May 23. And you'll see that it went down dramatically. Well, let's go ahead and throw up M2 money supply. This is another money aggregate total that you would expect to increase quite substantially if Janet Yellen is spending almost $1 trillion into the economy. And just like M1, we see that it actually declined. Now, for those of you who have watched a lot of my videos and are really paying attention right now, I'm sure you're probably saying to yourself, okay, George, I get what you're saying here, but we all know that the entities that are really in charge of the money supply would be the banksters themselves. So if they are lending a lot less, in other words, on net balance, if there are more loans that are being paid off than are actually being taken out or being created by the banks, then you would expect that to put downward pressure on the overall supply of currency units. In other words, these money aggregates that we showed earlier. But editor, go ahead and throw up a chart of overall bank credit from this time period, and we see that it's pretty much flat. So where did this almost $1 trillion go? Did they give it to you? Did you bury it in your backyard? Nah, I didn't think so. They definitely didn't give it to me. But we've got to figure this out. We've got to put our CSI detective hat on, because when we do, this leads us to the secret that I was talking about before, that Janet Yellen and Jerome Powell have been hiding from you.
Step number 2. All right, now let's go ahead and start putting some of the pieces of the puzzle together. First of all, when was the last time you went to Walmart, Home Depot, or Target? My guess is in the very recent past, maybe even today or this week. And why? Because those are hugely popular stores that most Americans frequent, at least on a weekly basis, to get kind of the staples, the stuff they need. All right. Well, when you go to Walmart, when you go to Home Depot, when you go to Target, where are those goods coming from? Well, most of them are not coming from the United States, I can assure you. They're coming from China, Indonesia, Malaysia, Mexico, etc. Let's actually go to a visual representation of this from none other than the visual capitalist. And we can see the largest importers in the United States. These are US corporations. The top 3, like I just said, Walmart, Target, Home Depot. Number 4, Lowe's, Dole's Food, Samsung, Family Dollar Tree, LG Group, Philips, and IKEA. And of course, the list goes on and on and on. But let's think about this. When you're going to one of these stores, or when you're buying any of this electronic equipment, what you're doing is you're taking your dollars and you're sending them outside of the United States. And you're trading those dollars for the goods that you're buying at IKEA, as an example. So now let's go over to a chart of the United States trade deficit. Well, there's a chart of the trade balance, but I can assure you we are not running a surplus. That is for sure. If we look at the time frame that we discussed earlier, from May of 2022 to May of 2023, in 2022 we see the deficit was about 85 billion for the month. Now, fortunately, that improved slightly, but when we get to May of 2023, we're still right around $65 billion a month. So if you just average this out and say, well, it's roughly $80 billion a month, then you come to a number that's very close to the 1 trillion that Janet spent out of the TGA during this time frame. But there's a lot more to the story than just the trade deficit. But this starts to explain what's happening behind the scenes. Basically, Janet Yellen takes all those dollars, spends them into the real economy. The individuals and entities in the real economy take those dollars and they basically ship them to China, Indonesia, Mexico, or whoever our trading partners are that are sending us the goods in return. Now, normally this wouldn't be a problem, assuming the banks were functioning like they typically do and extending credit to borrowers. And whether we like it or not, we live in a debt-based monetary system. So you need the debt to continue to go up, assuming that velocity is staying constant. And if you have velocity going down, well, then you really, really need the debt to go up and go up very quickly, or else you're going to go into a deflationary bust, similar to what we saw during the 1930s. Like we said in step number 1, the banks aren't lending, and these monetary aggregates are actually going down. And to tell you how unprecedented this is, the last time we saw M2 money supply actually decline was, in fact, during the 1930s and the Great Depression.
Step number 3. Now I'm going to reveal Janet and Jerome's little secret they don't want you to know about. This is something I believe they've been hiding from the general public. Let's start with the chart going all the way back to 2008. We go to today's date on the left, 0 trillion all the way up to $9 trillion. Most of you will recognize exactly what this is. It's the Fed's BS. And I'll let you determine what BS actually stands for. But we know back in 2008, it was right around 800 billion with a B dollars, under a trillion. Then we do quantitative easing, 1, 2, 3, and we go up to call it 4 or 5 trillion. And then we start to do QT and it goes down, but then we have the repo blow up and they start QE again. And then we have the cerveza sickness. And you guys know the story from there. The Fed's balance sheet explodes higher, up over $9 trillion. And what I want you to focus on is this red line specifically that highlights the time frame we've been discussing throughout this video, May 2022 to May 2023, when Janet Yellen's checking account went down by over $900 billion, almost a trillion. So during this time frame, Jerome Powell's balance sheet went down by about $400 billion. This little blip right there is the BTFP, where they bailed out the banking system in March of 2023. But where it gets interesting is when you start analyzing the mechanics behind what happens when the Fed is actually doing QT, or they're reducing the size of their balance sheet. Let's go down here, and it looks, well, it's a modification on what we did in step number 1. We've got Jerome Powell right here, and then Janet Yellen right there in the middle, obviously. And she is taking in tax dollars, let's say, from this guy who's pissed off because he's paying his fair share. And instead of spending that money back out into the economy, this time Janet has to do something different. You see, because Jerome Powell has a lot of these treasuries on his balance sheet, and he might not be selling them back into the market, but he's allowing them to mature. So let's say that he's got a treasury that's maturing today for $1 billion. Okay, well, what happens? Janet Yellen has to pay him that $1 billion. We'll assume there's no interest whatsoever. So you got to pay him the principal in full. So does she do that by actually giving him dollars and maybe he spends them back into the economy? No, absolutely not. It's the exact same process as you making a payment to your bank. Maybe you've got a mortgage with Wells Fargo, let's say, and every single month you pay them $2,000. Well, do they actually take dollar bills from you? No, they just simply reduce your balance that you have with them in your checking account or your savings account. So they're not really increasing the asset side of their balance sheet. They're simply reducing the liability side. That's exactly what Jerome Powell does. Remember, Janet Yellen's account is a liability of the Federal Reserve, the TGA. So if she makes a payment to Jerome Powell for, let's say, $1 billion, then he simply reduces her account balance by that much. So in this case, let's say he reduced her account balance from $900 billion down to $500 billion. That's where we get this drop of $400 billion. Now, before we move on, I want to be very, very clear. I'm just using approximate numbers, and there's multiple variables. As an example, Janet Yellen might not be paying Jerome Powell. Janet Yellen could be paying Jamie Dimon. And if she's paying Jamie Dimon for treasuries that he has on his balance sheet with JP Morgan, the exact same process would happen. Her account balance would go down, and those reserves would go into JP Morgan's account, but that would not have an impact on, let's say, M2 money supply, or those broad aggregates that we talked about in step number 1. So I don't want to get into too much detail because it gets very, very, very complicated, and we'll have to save that for a completely separate video. And again, I want to be very clear before moving on. I'm not addressing all of the variables, and I'm using approximate numbers just so you guys can understand the concepts of what's actually happening behind the scenes. So why the mechanics really matter when Jerome Powell is doing quantitative tightening is because Janet Yellen isn't going to spend that money back into the economy. Remember, if she's receiving it in tax dollars, then she's spending it back out. Well, that's going to mean the money aggregate on net balance is the exact same. But if she's receiving it and then giving to Jerome Powell, and he takes it by reducing her account balance, then there's nothing going back into the economy. Therefore, on net balance, all else being equal, the money aggregates are going to decline. And that's where we run into a big problem. When you combine what Jerome Powell is doing with the trade deficit and money leaving the United States, like we talked about before. Now, the money supply shrinking in and of itself isn't that big of a deal. For those of you who study economics or just have some common sense, you realize that if we go from $20 trillion circulating in the U.S. economy down to $10 trillion, well, prices would just adjust, assuming that we could get rid of minimum wage and whatnot. And it's not, we just have fewer currency units chasing the exact same amount of goods and services. As long as the goods and services don't change, does the price of that drink that you normally buy for $2 goes down to $1, and your wages pretty much get cut in half, but your purchasing power is the exact same. So it really doesn't matter. But what is a big deal is if you have an economy with a tremendous amount of debt. So if the money supply goes down, well, then the prices of goods, services, stuff goes down as well. But the cost every single month of those debt payments does not go down. It stays the exact same. So if people have the exact same amount of debt, or if the debt's actually increasing, but the amount of money they have is actually decreasing, that math doesn't work. Like we said when I was a kid, that dog don't hunt for very long at all. So I think Jerome Powell and Janet Yellen are looking at these monetary aggregates, they're looking at the trade deficit, and they're looking at QT, and they're saying, whoa, we have got to pump the brakes, because we can come out and tell the general public how we're fighting inflation and we're getting really tough on these prices going up because we know it's negatively impacting the consumer. But behind closed doors, I think the real secret is they're much more worried about a deflationary bust than they are a reacceleration of consumer price inflation. And just the other day, when they came out and made the announcement about holding interest rates steady, they also made an announcement about QT and said they were going to reduce QT from $60 billion a month down to $25 billion a month. In other words, they're going to leave an additional $35 billion a month in the economy, most likely to service this debt, instead of extracting it like they have been since May of 2022. So the bottom line is, regardless of what they do with interest rates, or regardless of what the rhetoric is around whatever psyop they're trying to push in the mainstream media, the bottom line is their balance sheet likely won't go down much further. And my base case would be, if we fast forward a year or two, it will start going back up and actually exceed the level we saw before, especially if bank lending remains flat or actually declines in the future. At the end of the day, I think they're far more worried about 1930s deflation than they are about a 1970s style inflation. Hey guys, I want to remind everybody that coming up May 31st through June 2nd in Orlando is Rebel Capitalist Live. This is the annual conference I do, and this year it's going to be absolutely incredible. I think it's going to be the best Rebel Capitalist Live we've done. We've got some amazing speakers, some incredible VIP guests. This is an event that you're not going to want to miss. I can assure you of that. So you can get your tickets. You can check out all the details and a list of speakers at rebelcapitalistlive.com, and I will see you in Orlando May 31st.